We do have to get serious. We want to talk for a second about, obviously, Mr. Wrestling 2, Johnny Walker, passed away this past week, and he was 85. He had actually had a heart attack right after the Charlotte Fan Fest. Probably about 5 or 6 years ago. That's the first time I had seen him in ages. He was living in Hawaii, has been living in Hawaii, came back out and did that Fan Fest. And the next morning, everybody was going home, and he woke up having a heart attack and was on the phone with somebody, said, I can't breathe. And they said, well, you ought to go to the hospital. And, ended up that's what happened. So he was lucky there. But, everybody was talking about Wrestling 2 is possibly, I guess, would you think, because his heyday came later than the Destroyer, so he's the most recent American masked guy that really was iconic and meant something. I mean, until you get, like, if you consider Kane being a masked guy for some period of time or whatever, but the mask is like everything else. It isn't protected as much as it used to be. The big thing with Wrestling 2 was like Mascaras. When I'd been in the business before 7 years before I saw Mascaras without his mask. I've told that story. It was 1989, and he came up to Corpus Christi for the Clash of Champions. And I was in the airport with Flair and Kevin and Sullivan, and they pointed him out to me because I'd never seen him, obviously, and he didn't wear the mask flying internationally. There was actually pictures of Mascaras on planes in Mexico wearing the mask. But anyway, he gets off the fucking plane at the airport in Corpus Christi without the mask. He looked like a middle-aged Mexican businessman, right? A suit and tie and balding and just nondescript. But then when you see him in the same suit, but he's got that mask on, he looked like somebody. And it was the same thing with 2. That's one of the reasons why I think that he came up with the mask. He worked as the grappler in Florida for a while in the late 60s, early 70s, and then did Mr. Wrestling 2 in Georgia starting in, 73. Johnny Walker looked old even when he was young, and he was balding, and he looked nondescript, and especially in the 80s, by the time that I saw him and got to work with him, he really looked like an old man if he was just standing around, but he put that mask on and the body worked, and it lengthened his career 15 years, I guess. He didn't retire until the late 80s, and he'd been wrestling for almost 20 years when he put the fucking thing on. So, but as I said, the mask has been, cheapened. You never saw, that was the thing. You want to see Wrestling 2 without his mask. You want to see Mil Mascaras without his mask. And some of the other major masked guys had that mystique back in the 60s, 70s, or whatever. But Wrestling 2 worked it. I worked in the same territory, Mid-South Wrestling, as him. That was our first main event program against he and Magnum TA for the Mid-South Tag Team title. We had matches every night for 2 months, almost every night for 2 months with him. And I saw him without his mask exactly one time in his car on the way to a show. And Dennis Condrey, who had worked Georgia, knew who it was, and he knew 2's car. He said, watch, there's 2. We're about to pass him. By then, 2 was old and cranky. JR has talked about this. He didn't want to ride with the young guys. He wasn't doing the things the young guys were doing, and he was just cranky anyway. He had this little bitty car. They got like 50 miles to the gallon, and he'd drive himself to. That's another reason he was riding himself in Mid-South Wrestling, or driving himself and riding alone, and those trips were brutal. So he was always kind of cranky, but he looked like a fucking regular, your average neighbor down the street. And then when he put that mask and that outfit on, it transformed him, body language and everything. But those were he showered with the mask. I mean, he was in the babyface locker room most of the time. So even if we were in the locker room together, he showered in the mask. He wore it. He stopped his car 4 or 5 miles from the building and put the mask on, and he wore it the same amount of distance away from the shows at night, more if he thought the people were following him. And, and so he had some mystery to him, but he was over. He had fire in his promo. He had gruff voice. He sounded like he meant business. He'd been working so long. He knew what to do. He knew how to sell as a baby face and fight and stay with it. And he had that fucking knee lift and just the way that he moved around. He actually, that old balding looking fucker, but when he put the mask on, he had the soul and the head bob and the fucking, little dance and everything. It transformed him. And the fans at that time in Mid-South, Bobby didn't understand what the fucking deal was. The first week we worked with them, we got 2 down and started getting some heat on him. And the people not only checked 2, 2, 2, 2, but it took him for a second to get it. But they were doing the thing that he would do when he would sell. He'd put his 2 fingers up and he'd start bopping the 2 fingers up and down with his arms and bending them. And Bobby thought, he said, what is he trying to fucking scratch me? What's he doing with his fingers? But then once he'd start doing that, that would make the people start going 2, 2, 2, just that thing with his fingers. And he'd have the whole fucking place going 2, 2, 2 with just his fucking fingers while he was in a goddamn chin lock. And then his body language, he'd start slowly standing up and get a little bit stronger. And then he'd start firing back and they'd blow. Anyway, that was really his last run. He switched heel on Magnum, which was a way of getting them out of our program. We beat them for the belts, but the switch happened in the match where we won the belts, so they didn't need to come back and get revenge. Then we headed to the Last Stampede and the Rock and Roll Express. And 2 worked a program with Magnum to, teacher versus student to get him over. And then did that thing with Dog, which we might talk about in a second. Remind me to ask about it. And then brought Hercules Hernandez in to be the new Mr. Wrestling 2, and Wrestling 2 became just Mr. Wrestling. And then he entered, and then when he left the territory, we took the mask off Hercules. He became my bodyguard. But 2 was over in that territory for that couple of year run that he had there. And of course, in Georgia, he may have been the most popular babyface of the first half of the 70s, and like Tim Woods was last part of the 60s, and in a different way like Tommy Rich was the last few years of the 70s. But he was amazingly over. And they thought the thing with Dog, you mentioned it before we went on the air, the one fart in that whole deal was when Wrestling 2 switched heel and left Magnum adrift. They were going to try to get heat on him. Was it for the North American title? He beat Dog for the title, didn't he?
Yeah, it was.
Okay. Junkyard Dog was the North American champion. They were going to do the deal where 2 fucked him out of the title so that he could then, turn around and drop it to Magnum. And Dog would lose the loser leave town stipulation so that he could go away for a month or whatever it was. And then Stagger Lee would come back to team with Watts against the Midnight Express in the Last Stampede. So all this was carefully worked out. And of course, the $1 million knee lift wasn't enough to beat the Junkyard Dog in New Orleans, as a previous email attested. He was over like God. So 2 was going to load the knee pad. And 2 loaded the fucking knee pad and ran and hit the Dog with the fucking knee lift. And Dog, at that time, it was just a month or 2 or 3 before he was going to leave and go to the WWF. And he had gained a lot of weight, and he was definitely on the shit. And he had lost he was still over, but he had lost the rawness and the oomph and the power that made him the Dog that got him over. And he just took the shittiest bump. He just kind of stiffened up and timbered, and it looked phony, and the people groaned. And we were there that night early. It was a decent house in New Orleans. We were there that night earlier, but since that match went on last, me and the Midnight left and took the opportunity to get out of there before the people would be in the parking lot, so we wouldn't need the fucking cops on the horses and everything. We just got the fuck out. But by the time that was a Monday night, right? So I think we did TV that week, so we would have been at the interviews on Wednesday, and then TV taping that night, and we saw the tape. And we heard about what happened. And nobody was going to say it to JYD's face because he was still, the guy and everything. But, oh, my God, that's what first hurt Dog. in New Orleans. It hurt New Orleans in general. And it just two didn't get over because the people thought that Dog took a dive. As once again, and you've heard this story before from other people than me. But the way that people thought about wrestling then and about JYD specifically, it was like Austin hugging McMahon. JYD took a dive. That looked fake. I don't believe it anymore. It hurt the fucking town and hurt the fucking business. But anyway, on a more positive note, here's a trivia answer for you that only the people who have ordered and actually received Tuesday Night at the Gardens are aware of. Johnny Walker was the first challenger to an NWA World Champion in the city of Louisville, Kentucky, between 1955 and 1970. When Jarrett first opened up, the NWA title hadn't been defended obviously the town was dark for 5 years. And then before that, Barnett was running it, or Bruiser and Snyder were running it out of Indiana. And before that was Barnett out of the Indianapolis office, the Midwest office. They didn't use the NWA champion. Buddy Rogers was here, but he didn't defend the title here as any research that I have been led to see believe, or any that I've seen leads me to believe. So it would have been Thez back in the mid-50s under the Allen Athletic Club when the NWA title was last defended in Louisville until Jarrett opened up in 1970. Johnny Walker happened to be the top name babyface in the territory at the time that he was able to get in Louisville on semi-regular occasion. Lynn Rossi and Bearcat Brown, Tojo and Jerry Jarrett were the babyface tag teams. So Johnny Walker got the spot against Dory, and that's the last NWA title match we got in Louisville until 1974. So there's some trivia for you. If this was Louisville, Johnny Walker would be getting a parade down Broadway.
He was the favorite of Jerry Jarrett's, wasn't he?
He did like it because Jarrett was instrumental in pushing the Wrestling 2 gimmick. Jarrett claims he invented it. We have had a timeline that suggests that maybe he was doing it before Jarrett took the book in Atlanta, but that Jarrett definitely did push him. But yeah, he had worked the Tennessee territory a number of times as Johnny Walker. And Jarrett liked that fire and liked the way he connected with the promos. But anyway, I guess who is the oldest living wrestler now? Uncle Dave was printing that information every time another old timer would pass, but 85 and 86 is getting up into the rare air as far as wrestling personalities go. Isn't it like between 85 and 92 now?
Len Rossi is probably, if he's not 90, he's closing in on 90. I know
yeah.
that. For a while it was the Hawaiian guys like Neff Maava and Ed Francis, but they both passed.
Lance Russell was up there, Pampiro Firpo.
Yeah. It's funny, a lot of the guys who had healthy lifestyles, Firpo, Len Rossi, Bruno Sammartino, the guys that lived a long time. It's probably not.
Well, imagine that. The people that had healthy lifestyles and took care of themselves had longer lives. Who would have thought?
It's probably not Len Rossi, but Len Rossi's probably one of the oldest living wrestlers right now. I don't know who else. Off the top of my head, I'm trying to think who else is around. I don't know.
Well, and also, by the way, I think Wrestling 2's family, at least, his household, thanks to his wife, Miss Livia, probably made as much off costuming as he did off wrestling, especially in the years when he was slowing down, because Wrestling 2's wife is the one who made all of the famous 70s and 80s robes for Flair and Greg Valentine and Wrestling 2 and all those beautiful robes and all the sequins and the feathers and the boas and all that stuff that you would see guys wearing then. She's the one that made them. And I think Flair and Valentine, when they were on top in the Carolinas as world tag team champions in the late 70s, they were both making $150,000 a piece per year in just the Carolinas. That's before they had to fucking go to the Northeast and they expanded, etc. And they were taking limousines to the fucking matches, and they had a robe contest because those things cost back then between $3,000 and $6,000 a piece. And what is that math for today's money? And, from late 70s, early 80s. But that's why Flair ended up with a lot of those robes. He just started fucking having a contest with the other guys so he could get the most of them. Anyway, Mr. Wrestling 2.